Okay, how can a manifold proceed to the understanding? So, as we have covered earlier, a manifold is basically the disorganized array of empirical objects as they're presented to the mind. But how exactly do we understand objects in the world? How do we categorize them? How do we differentiate from, say, a cat from another cat? And this was one of the key topics that Kant discussed in his critique of pure reason, which is how we know what we know and how we can know at all. And a manifold proceeds to the understanding through the mind, understanding, organizing, and categorizing particular objects from a manifold via the table of 12 categories, which you can see there. Now, the table of 12 categories was from the Critique of Pure Reason, and how Kant came up with all of these categories is quite complex. There was some really complicated logic going on in a section called the Transcendental Deduction of Categories, which I won't go into too much detail right now, but all you need to know is that there are these 12 categories by which we understand the world and categorize objects. And these 12 categories can be separated into four. There's quantity, quality, relation, and modality. Quantity is quite self-evident. It's how much of something there is. Quality is quite simple as well. It's whether it has any properties specifically, and it's to do with the predicates of the concept, and more so like the predicates that concern the entire concept. And yeah, we also have relation, which is how the object relates to other objects, and modality, which concerns the logical conditions of the object. And I think one of the key categories you should pay attention to is the category of community, which is the reciprocity between the active and the passive. And I think you should pay attention to this in particular because it ties in well with Kantian ethics. Because in Kantian ethics, the first formulation of the categorical imperative suggests that basically you should will everything to be a universal law and do things as if everyone would do it as well. And this is really similar to the Bible verse Matthew 7:12, which suggests you should do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And basically, it suggests that there's a certain reciprocity or reciprocal relation between the active and passive. And an example of this is if you have a bully. The bully is actively beating up a victim, and the victim is, in this case, the passive. And so, using the category of community, you could say that because there's this reciprocity, the bully is beating up the victim as much as the victim is bullying the bully, and as much as the bully is bullying themselves, and as much as the victim is victimizing themselves. And this is quite an interesting concept. And Kant calls this entire process of the 12 categories being unconsciously used to organize and distinguish objects from the manifold, the synthetic unity of the manifold. And so it's quite self-evident. You synthetically unify objects from the manifold and you distinguish their predicates and properties. And this idea of synthetic ties well into Kantian logic, although it's not formally called Kantian logic because Kant thought that the Aristotelian system of logic was already complete. But anyways, Kant thought that aside from Hume's fork, where you have your analytic judgments where things are self-evident, for example, all dogs are animals, And you also have your synthetic judgments, which are things known through experience, or supposedly only known through experience, or things that are not self evident. For example, all dogs in Hong Kong are white. And that is obviously not true, so it is most likely a synthetic proposition. And Kant thought that there was a third one called the synthetic a priori. And if you may remember, the a priori links to rationalism. And basically, synthetic a priori judgments are judgments where it is not analytic, exists in the rational plane alone, and thus can only be synthetic. For example, you can take geometry. There's the common statement, the shortest path from A to B is a straight line. Well, you cannot know this through analytic truths because this is not self evident. You can't know this through synthetic because it's not directly empirically known. And thus, you can only know it through synthetic a priori judgments, and you know it synthetically in a way, but also a priori. And Kant thought that this was the final stage of empirical apperception. And there was this quote I forgot to include where Kant basically said that knowledge begins with experience and ends with the understanding, or the reason, or human reason, or pure reason.